In the spring of 2022, a trail camera mounted on a black cherry tree about 40 yards behind a house in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, recorded something that the man who owned the camera had spent the better part of 3 decades telling himself did not exist. The camera was a stealth cam bought at the Walmart in Marlinton, mounted at chest height, aimed at a game trail that came down off a steep hollow where mowed pasture met the tree line of the Monongahela National Forest. He had put it there to monitor bear activity. Black bears had been getting into his garbage, pulling the cans off the back porch and dragging them into the yard, and he wanted to know how many he was dealing with and what time they were coming through. What the camera recorded on the night of April 19th was not a bear. The infrared image shows something crossing the game trail on 2 legs. The stride is long and fluid, covering ground the way nothing in the West Virginia Field Guide covers ground while upright. The head in profile is wrong for a person. The muzzle extends forward. The ears are pointed and high on the skull. The body is broad through the chest and shoulders, and the arms hang longer than any human arms, past where the hips would be on a man of that height. It crosses the frame and is gone. He watched it on the SD card reader at his kitchen table the next morning, and the first thing he did was check the camera to make sure it was functioning correctly. The second thing he did was watch it again. He had been a conservation officer with the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources for the better part of 30 years. He had tracked black bear, whitetail, turkey, coyote, bobcat, and the occasional reported cougar sighting across some of the most remote terrain in the eastern United States. He knew what every large animal in these mountains looked like on a trail camera, in daylight and infrared, at every angle and distance. What was on that SD card was a DOGMEN. He knew at the moment he saw the head shape. He had heard the word before, always in the context of something he dismissed, something that belonged to campfire talk and internet forums and the kind of late-night radio programming that his wife would sometimes fall asleep listening to. He had dismissed it for 30 years. The footage on that SD card made dismissal impossible. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. His name has been changed at his request. We will call him Merle. Given what happened to his standing in the community after he started asking questions he should not have been asking, you will understand why he does not want his real name attached to this. Merle grew up in the Greenbrier Valley and spent his childhood in the mountains the way most boys in that part of West Virginia did, hunting squirrel and grouse with his father and grandfather before he was old enough to carry a deer rifle. He joined the Division of Natural Resources in the late 80s after finishing a degree in wildlife management at a state university in the region. His first assignment was running trap lines for predator census in the Cranberry backcountry, setting and checking traps in terrain so steep and remote that the department issued him a mule for the first 2 seasons, until budget cuts eliminated the pack string, and he started carrying everything on his back. His assignment for most of his career was the Marlinton White Sulphur Springs Ranger District and the surrounding DNR wildlife management areas, which put him in the heart of the Monongahela National Forest for the better part of 3 decades. He worked predator surveys, bear population monitoring, deer management, elk reintroduction assessments, and the occasional poaching investigation that took him deep into hollows where the roads ended and the forest floor had not seen sunlight in 100 years. He qualified annually with his department-issue sidearm and carried it on every field assignment. He had used it twice in 30 years, both times to dispatch injured deer. He was a man whose colleagues trusted his field assessments without question. When Merle identified a track, it was identified. When he called a predator sign, that was the final word. That reputation is what he is protecting by keeping his name off this story. He retired in his late 50s, a few years before the trail camera incident, and settled on a piece of property along a hollow south of Marlinton, where the county road turns to gravel and the gravel turns to dirt, and the dirt eventually gives way to a Forest Service gate and the beginning of the Cranberry Wilderness. Pocahontas County is the 3rd largest county in West Virginia by area and one of the least populated, with fewer than 8,000 people spread across nearly 1,000 square miles of mountain terrain. The county seat is Marlinton, a town of about 1,000 on the Greenbrier River. The river runs south through a narrow valley flanked by the Allegheny Mountains, and the mountains on the west side rise into some of the most remote backcountry east of the Mississippi. The Cranberry Wilderness alone covers nearly 48,000 acres of roadless terrain where elevations range from 2,400 feet in the river valleys to over 4,600 feet on the ridgelines. It is a designated black bear sanctuary. The Forest Service describes it as broad mountains dissected by deep and narrow valleys, and that description is accurate, but it does not capture what it feels like to stand on one of those ridgelines at dusk and look west across drainage after drainage of unbroken forest, rolling to the horizon without a single light, a single road, a single structure visible in any direction. 8 rivers have their headwaters in Pocahontas County: the Williams River, the Cranberry River, the Gauley, the Greenbrier, the Elk, the Tygart Valley, Shaver's Fork of the Cheat. The water comes off these mountains in every direction, and the forests that hold it are thick enough and steep enough that there are places in the Cranberry drainage where you could walk for 2 full days without crossing a maintained trail. Merle's property sits at the bottom of a hollow that runs north-south between 2 ridges. The house is about a quarter mile off the county road, at the end of a gravel driveway that crosses a small creek on a wooden bridge he built himself. Behind the house, the land rises steeply through mixed hardwoods, mostly red oak and sugar maple and tulip poplar, before hitting a band of red spruce near the ridgeline at around 3,800 feet. The forest behind the house is National Forest land, managed by the Marlinton White Sulphur Springs Ranger District. There is no fence, no boundary marker a person would notice. The forest behind Merle's house is continuous with the forest that stretches west into the Cranberry Wilderness, north toward Snowshoe Mountain, and south toward the Greenbrier County line. If something large wanted to walk from the deep interior of the Cranberry drainage to Merle's back porch, it could do so without crossing a single road or clearing. His neighbor to the south, a man we will call Clyde, runs about 60 head of cattle on a 100-acre parcel that backs up against the same national forest boundary. Clyde's family has been on that land for 4 generations. He is a quiet man in his mid-60s who attends the Methodist Church in Marlinton and keeps to himself, and the only reason he is part of this story is that his cattle operation became the first tangible evidence that something had changed in the mountains above them. What Merle noticed first, before the trail camera footage, was the absence of sound. In March of 2022, about a month before the camera captured what it captured, his hollow went quiet. He had lived there for several years and had developed the kind of relationship with the ambient noise of his property that anyone in the country develops. You learn the sounds. The barred owls that call from the hemlocks along the creek starting around dusk. The turkeys that gobble from the ridge in the early mornings. The coyote packs that howl from the high ground after midnight. The spring peepers in the creek bottom that start up in late March and create a wall of noise so constant you stop hearing it within a day. All of that stopped. The peepers were still there, but the turkeys were gone from the ridge. The barred owls went silent. The coyotes stopped howling entirely. Merle noticed it the way you notice a headache, a feeling that the hollow was holding its breath. He mentioned it to Clyde one afternoon at the post office in Marlinton. Clyde said he had noticed the same thing. Said his cattle had been bunching up at the far end of the pasture, the end closest to the road and farthest from the tree line, refusing to graze the upper field that bordered the forest. Cattle do that when predators are around. But Clyde said this felt different from bears. When bears come down in the spring, cattle get skittish for a day or 2 and then settle. This had been going on for weeks, and his dogs had changed. 2 farm dogs, both mixed breeds, both outdoor animals who had run loose on that property their whole lives. They were sleeping under the porch now, would not go past the barn after dark. A bear moving through does not silence a hollow for weeks. A coyote pack establishing new territory announces itself constantly with vocalizations, and farm dogs in Pocahontas County grow up around bears and coyotes. They bark at them. They chase them. They do not hide under the porch. 2 days after the trail camera captured its footage, Merle went out to the camera site. The ground along the game trail was soft from spring rain, and the tracks were there. Canid morphology, 4 toes with claw marks forward of each pad. The impression was roughly 6 inches long by 5 inches wide. The stride between consecutive left footprints was 46 inches. A large gray wolf leaves a track about 4.5 inches long with a walking stride of around 26 to 30 inches. What Merle was looking at was bigger than the largest wolf track ever documented in North America, and the stride implied an animal walking upright at a height well over 7 feet. He photographed the tracks with a ruler and frame. He measured the straddle, the lateral distance between left and right tracks, and got 9 inches. That was much wider than a canid walking in the direct register gait wolves and coyotes use. 9 inches of straddle on a bipedal gait pattern meant something broad and heavy moving upright. He cast the 2 best tracks with plaster of Paris from a kit he kept from his DNR days. Then he went inside and sat at his kitchen table and thought about what he was going to do with what he had found. He put up more cameras. Over 3 weeks, he deployed 5 additional trail cameras in a loose arc along the tree line and extending south toward Clyde's fence line. He used his own cameras because he had retired and no longer had access to department resources, and because there was no category in the DNR's wildlife monitoring system for what he was tracking. The Division of Natural Resources maintains databases for black bear, whitetail, turkey, grouse, coyote, bobcat, and a handful of other species. There is a reporting mechanism for cougar sightings. There is no mechanism, no database field, no checkbox on any form for a large bipedal canid. The system does not have a place for it. Through April and into May, Merle documented 11 separate motion-triggered events he could not attribute to any catalog species. One clip, captured on May 3rd at approximately 1:15 in the morning, showed 2 figures moving together through the forest about 30 yards from the nearest camera. They were walking uphill, away from the creek bottom, heading toward the ridge. They were upright, moving in parallel, maintaining about 15 feet of separation, matching pace. The coordination was precise. One was noticeably larger than the other. He started keeping a journal. Dates, weather conditions, moon phase, temperature, wind direction. He was falling back on training, the same systematic documentation he had used for 3 decades to track predator populations across the Monongahela. The irony was plain. He was using the skills the state had taught him to study something the state refused to acknowledge. Through May, the creatures moved through the forest behind his property on a roughly every 3rd night rotation. They came down from the ridge after midnight and moved through the transitional zone between the hardwood forest and the creek bottom, following game trails. Their movement corridor ran within 40 yards of his house. He found deer remains twice. Both showed evidence of being killed by something that broke the neck and opened the throat with a single, powerful bite. Both carcasses had been dragged to the base of trees that showed fresh claw marks running from about 5 feet to nearly 7.5 feet up the trunk. Territorial marking. 4 parallel gouges spaced at roughly 3 inches apart, each cutting through bark into cambium. The spacing was wider than any bear claw pattern Merle had documented in 30 years, and 7.5 feet of reach. The largest black bear he had ever documented in Pocahontas County topped out at around 5'10" standing upright. By June, he had mapped a pattern extending well beyond his property. He walked transects through the national forest, following game trails up to the ridgeline and along the ridge. He found evidence everywhere, track impressions along creek banks, claw-marked trees at intervals suggesting a territorial boundary running north-south, scat containing fur and bone fragments consistent with deer but larger than any canid scat he had ever seen, carrying a dense, musky odor he did not associate with any known species. And the smell itself, thick, organic, somewhere between wet dog and something decomposing but sharper. He encountered it at the claw-marked trees, and at a spot along the ridge where undergrowth had been flattened in an oval about 8 feet long, as if something large had bedded down. The activity was expanding. In his first weeks of monitoring, camera events were within a couple 100 yards of the tree line. By June, he was finding tracks a 1/4 mile south of his property and a 1/3 of a mile north. The expansion correlated with something Merle had been aware of but had not initially connected. The Beech Ridge Wind Farm in Greenbrier County, about 20 miles south. The wind farm had been operational since 2010, with 67 turbines along the ridge lines of Shell Camp, Smokehouse, Beach, Rock Camp, and Big Ridges. A second phase added 20 more turbines in 2019 and 2020. The construction involved extensive road building and clearing along ridgelines that connected to the same mountain system where Merle was finding activity, something that had been living in the high country In the remote ridgelines where the Cranberry Wilderness and the Greenbrier County backcountry provided continuous deep forest at elevations above 4,000 feet, had been pushed. The construction disrupted habitat, created noise and light pollution on ridgelines that had been dark and silent for generations, and severed travel corridors that connected high-elevation territories across the county line. The turbines themselves generate a low-frequency pulse that radiates through the forest constantly. Merle had read enough about infrasound to know that large animals are sensitive to low-frequency vibration in ways that humans are not. If there was something in these mountains that relied on low-frequency vocalization for communication, the way the audio evidence suggested, the wind turbines would represent an unrelenting source of interference, a noise you cannot escape because it is too low to consciously hear, but too persistent to habituate to. Whatever had been up there had made a calculation and acted on it. It had moved downhill, down the drainages, down the creek bottoms, into the hollows where people like Merle and Clyde lived at the edge of the national forest, in the transitional zone between wilderness and civilization that had always served as a buffer. The creatures had come down the mountain, and they had not gone back up. July of 2022. The encounter that Merle describes as the night that divided his life into before and after. He had documented what he believed were at least 3 individuals based on track size variation. On the night of July 12th, a Wednesday, Merle was sitting on his back porch at approximately 11:30. His wife had gone to bed. He was drinking coffee, letting his ears adjust to the hollow, cataloging what he heard. A whippoorwill was calling from the North Ridge. Then it stopped. Merle had been a wildlife officer long enough to know what a predator silence sounds like. When a large predator moves through an area, the prey species go quiet. The silence radiates outward like a wave, and if you are paying attention, you can track the predator's movement by the expanding edge of it. The silence came from the west, from the ridge. It moved downhill. The whippoorwill went first, then the insects in the upper hollow, then the tree frogs along the creek bank. Within 3 or 4 minutes, the only sound was the creek itself. Merle reached inside for the thermal monocular he had bought after the April footage. He scanned the tree line behind the house. The first heat signature was 40 yards out, standing at the edge of the forest where mowed grass met trees. Upright, the thermal image showed a bright body temperature figure against cooler tree trunks. The head shape was wrong in exactly the way the trail camera footage had been wrong. He scanned left. A second heat signature, about 20 yards from the first, also upright, slightly smaller. He scanned right. A third, farther back, partially screened by a hemlock trunk. 3 of them. Standing at the edge of his property in a loose arc, facing the house. His heart rate was doing something he had not experienced since a confrontation with a wounded boar 2 decades ago, the kind of adrenaline dump that makes your hands shake and your vision narrow. He was a man who had spent 3 decades alone in the backcountry carrying a sidearm. He had never felt like prey. He felt like prey now. He watched through the thermal monocular for what he estimated was 4 or 5 minutes. They did not move toward the house. They did not vocalize. They stood in their loose formation with the stillness of animals that are completely comfortable in their environment and completely aware of every element in it. The one on the right shifted its weight from one foot to the other in a motion so human-like that Merle's brain tried to make it into a person, a hiker, a trespasser, anyone whose presence at the tree line at 11:30 at night could be explained by something other than what the thermal image was showing him. But the proportions were wrong. The torso was too deep, the arms were too long, and when it shifted, the moonlight caught its eyes, and 2 points of amber light reflected back from 40 yards, too high off the ground and too far apart to belong to anything he had ever seen in 30 years of field work. The eye shine was the detail that locked his hands around the monocular and would not let go. Amber, the color of a predator's tapetum lucidum bouncing back artificial or ambient light, the same reflective quality you see in a coyote's eyes from a car's headlights, but at 6.5 or 7 feet off the ground, set in a skull that was unmistakably canine in profile. The one in the center, the largest, turned its head. Merle watched through the monocular as the head swung from facing the house to facing the one on the left, then back, then to the right. It was checking on the others, confirming positions, the same head check that a team leader does before making a decision. Then the center figure took one step out of the tree line. onto the mowed grass, into the open. The moonlight caught the mass of it. Deep chest, dark fur, legs thick through the thigh. It stood on Merle's lawn, 40 yards from his porch, and looked at him. It knew he was there. The head was oriented directly at the porch. The eye reflection pointed straight at him. It had stepped into the open to let him see it. A statement. I am here. I see you. Now you see me. It stood there for maybe 5 seconds. Then it turned, dropped to all fours in a single fluid motion, and moved back into the tree line. The other two followed. Within seconds, all 3 heat signatures were heading uphill through the forest toward the ridge. Merle sat on his porch for another 2 hours. He listened to the sounds come back. The tree frogs first, then the insects, then the whippoorwill around 1 in the morning. The hollow breathed out. October brought the second piece of footage that changed his understanding. He had positioned a camera higher on the ridge, along an old abandoned logging road. On the night of October 9th, the camera captured a single figure approaching from the south. It was walking upright on the road. As it drew within about 20 yards, it stopped and turned its head directly toward the camera. Then it walked toward the camera, closed the distance, and reached for the lens with a hand. 5 articulated fingers, a grip that closed around the housing. The image tilted, blurred, and went dark. He found the camera the next morning on the ground, the mounting strap torn through the bark of the beech tree, gouging a channel a 1/4 inch deep. The housing was cracked, but the SD card was intact. The strap was heavy-duty nylon, rated for 50 pounds of pull force. Whatever grabbed the camera ripped the strap through solid wood rather than unhooking it. The footage of the hand was the clearest evidence he had of manipulative capability. The fingers were long, tapered with visible claws. The thumb was opposable. The grip was controlled. This was something that recognized the camera as a surveillance device, approached it directly, and removed it with purpose and understanding. He lost 3 more cameras over the next 2 months. Each time, the camera was pulled from its mount and left on the ground nearby. Each time, the SD card was intact. The creature was stopping the surveillance. It did not appear to care about what happened to the recording afterward. The distinction matters because it implies an understanding of function. The camera watches me, without necessarily understanding the downstream consequences of the recording. The creature cared about the eye. It did not care about the memory. Merle adapted. He had spent 30 years learning to outwit black bears and coyotes in the field, animals that are smart and curious, but that do not understand human surveillance technology. What he was dealing with now required a different approach. He built concealed camera housings using bark and moss, wrapping the units in natural material to break up the rectangular profile that the creature had learned to recognize. He positioned cameras inside hollow logs, aimed outward through gaps in the rotting wood. He buried cameras in leaf litter with only the lens exposed, covering the housing with a thin layer of decomposing leaves that would not trigger a visual search. He mounted cameras at 12 feet using climbing sticks, high enough that reaching them required effort. The concealed cameras lasted longer. The creature found some of them anyway, rooting through leaf cover, reaching into hollow logs. But the discovery interval stretched from days to weeks. And during those weeks, the cameras captured footage and audio. One clip caught 2 figures walking together, and the audio picked up a low-frequency vocalization that oscillated through a range of tones in a pattern that repeated 3 times, paused, and repeated with slight variation. The sound had structure. It was organized, with identifiable patterns and what sounded like intentional modulation. He played the recording for a retired acoustics researcher from the Green Bank Observatory in Pocahontas County. Green Bank sits inside the National Radio Quiet Zone, where electromagnetic interference is restricted to protect sensitive equipment. The researcher listened through professional-grade headphones and ran it through a spectrogram. The vocalization contained frequency components below 30 Hz, at the threshold of human hearing. The spectrogram showed repeating tonal patterns with consistent intervals between frequency shifts, which the researcher said was more characteristic of structured communication than random vocalization. He said he had never seen a spectrogram pattern like it from any animal in his catalog. He asked what animal had produced it. Merle said he was not sure. The researcher did not press. If you have ever driven Route 39 east from Richwood toward Marlinton, through the heart of the Monongahela, you know the terrain I am describing. The road follows the Cranberry River through a valley that feels like the bottom of a green canyon. If you have hiked into the Cranberry Wilderness, or spent time along the Williams River, or camped at the dispersed sites along the Forest Service roads, you know how quickly the forest closes in. Let me know in the comments if you have been in those mountains and experienced anything you could not explain, because the reports from the Pocahontas and Greenbrier County backcountry are consistent with what Merle has been documenting. The connection between Merle's data and the broader dogman phenomenon is one any serious researcher would recognize. The behavioral profile matches the pattern Linda Godfrey spent 3 decades documenting across the Great Lakes region: nocturnal, territorial marking, camera awareness, bipedal to quadrupedal transition, coordinated group behavior, territorial enforcement through warning rather than attack. Every one of those constants was present in Merle's data. The setting was different, the Allegheny Mountains rather than the flat forests of Wisconsin and Michigan. But the behavior was the same, the intelligence was the same, the territorial logic was the same. The dogman phenomenon is not new, and it is not regional. The first modern Michigan dogman sighting occurred in 1887 in Wexford County, when 2 lumberjacks encountered a creature with a man's body and a dog's head in the logging camps along the Manistee River. Steve Cook, the radio DJ in Traverse City, wrote a song called The Legend in 1987 as an April Fool's prank describing the Michigan dogmen. After it aired, the station was flooded with calls from people who had seen exactly what the song described. Encounters predating the song by decades. Witnesses who had carried their experiences in silence because they thought nobody would believe them. The song did not create the phenomenon. It gave the phenomenon a name and gave witnesses permission to speak. The historical context in Merle's landscape runs deep. The Shawnee people, whose ancestral homeland encompassed the Ohio Valley, including present-day West Virginia, were the dominant indigenous presence in the Allegheny Highlands during the 17th and 18th centuries. Their territory extended across Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, and they claimed the land west of the Alleghenies as hunting grounds. The Shawnee were an Algonquian-speaking people with a spiritual tradition deeply connected to the forests and waterways of the region. Their seasonal hunting camps brought them into terrain identical to the Cranberry Wilderness. The Monongahela people, a prehistoric culture that inhabited the Allegheny Plateau for centuries, left stone tools and ceramic fragments in village sites throughout the region before disappearing around 1635 for reasons that archaeologists still debate. Their name was given to the forest, the river, and the national forest itself. What they knew about the deep woods of this region disappeared with them, but the Shawnee, who moved into the territory afterward and maintained it as hunting ground through the 18th century, carried traditions that survived displacement. When Merle reached out to a contact at the Appalachian American Indian Association, which represents the estimated 11,000 Native American descendants in West Virginia, the response was careful. The person he spoke with would not be quoted by name. But they said that the old hunting stories, passed through families maintaining connection to Shawnee traditions despite the forced removals of the 19th century, included descriptions of beings in the deep forests of the Alleghenies that the old people did not name in English. Beings on the high ridges that came down to the valleys in certain seasons, beings that hunters gave wide berth to, adjusting camps and routes to avoid specific drainages understood to be occupied. These were not ghost stories. They were practical information about real hazards in real terrain, the same way you teach someone which creeks flood in the spring. Factual knowledge about the landscape, including what lived in it. In November of 2022, Merle got the call from Clyde that shifted the story from documentation to consequence. Clyde called at 6:30 on a Saturday morning. His voice was different in a way Merle had never heard. Clyde was a man who had dealt with every hazard cattle ranching in the Alleghenies could produce. He told Merle to come look at his upper pasture. Bring a camera. Merle drove over. Clyde was standing at the fence line, where the upper pasture met the tree line. He was holding his rifle, which Merle noted because Clyde did not carry a rifle while checking cattle. The fence was breached, not broken, breached. 2 fence posts had been pulled out of the ground. Not broken off. Not pushed over. Pulled straight up, the way you would pull a post if you gripped it with both hands and lifted. The posts were lying inside the pasture, and the wire attached to them was slack but unbroken. The staples that held wire to posts had been popped cleanly from the wood. The wire was spread apart, creating a gap about 6 feet wide, and the ground showed tracks, the same canid morphology bipedal tracks Merle had been documenting for 7 months. Multiple sets, different sizes. They had come through together. About 100 yards from the breach, a yearling heifer was dead, neck broken, throat opened with a single puncture and tear wound. Surprisingly little blood. The kill had been fast. The heifer weighed between 500 and 600 pounds, and whatever killed it did so with a single action that broke the cervical vertebrae and severed the major blood vessels simultaneously. But the kill was not the thing that changed Clyde's voice. The fence was. Clyde had dealt with bears. Bears go through fences. They push and tear and leave a mess. They do not pull fence posts out of the ground in a way that creates a clean gap wide enough to walk through upright without touching the wire. What Clyde was looking at was a fence that had been opened by something that understood how fences work, that understood the posts hold the wire, and that removing the posts is the most efficient way to create an opening without getting cut on the barbs. A bear does not understand fence engineering. Whatever opened Clyde's fence understood the system and defeated it methodically. Merle photographed everything. The pulled posts, the popped staples, the track evidence at the breach, the carcass and the kill wound. He measured tracks and stride lengths and added them to his data set. The tracks at the fence matched his previous measurements. At least 2 sets of prints were present at the breach, consistent with his estimate of 3 or more individuals operating in the corridor. Then he told Clyde everything. The trail cameras, the footage, the tracks, the territorial boundary, the claw-marked trees, the audio recording, the encounter on his porch in July. He laid it all out the way he would have laid out a predator report during his DNR career, with evidence and documentation and the measured tone of a professional presenting findings he trusted, even when they sounded impossible. When he was done, Clyde was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that means a man is deciding whether to say something he has never said out loud. Then Clyde said his grandmother used to tell him there were things in the high hollows that people did not talk about, and that his grandmother was Shawnee on her mother's side, and that the things she described matched what Merle had just told him about what was on those trail cameras. Clyde said his grandmother would reference certain drainages on the west side of the ridge, drainages that she said people should leave alone, and that when he asked her why, she would change the subject or say the old people knew things that did not need explaining. Clyde had filed those conversations away as superstition, standing in his upper pasture next to a dead heifer and a fence that had been opened by something that understood how fences work. He was filing them differently now. Clyde reported the kill as bear depredation. The DNR had a process for that. A young officer came out, looked at the carcass, looked at the fence, and wrote it up as a probable black bear. He told Clyde an unusually large bear was likely responsible and recommended electric fencing. He did not mention the fence posts. He did not mention that they had been pulled vertically rather than pushed over. He did not mention the canid tracks in soft soil 10 feet from where he was standing. He was operating within a framework that did not include what had actually happened, filling in the closest available category. Bear. The same way you file a report about something you cannot classify under the nearest label that makes it fit. After the livestock kill, Clyde reinforced his fence with steel T-posts and added electric wire. He moved his cattle out of the upper pasture for the winter. He bought a spotlight for his barn. He started locking his dogs inside at night. He made these adjustments quietly, without explaining them to anyone except his wife. Clyde is a man who adapts. He was not going to sell the farm his great-grandfather cleared in the years before the National Forest was established. He was not going to leave the land that 4 generations of his family had worked through depressions and floods and timber busts and everything else that the Alleghenies threw at the people who tried to make a living in them. He was going to adjust his operation to account for a predator that his government did not acknowledge, the way he adjusted for ice storms and droughts and falling beef prices and everything else the agencies never fully accounted for. That is the Appalachian response to the impossible. You do not leave. You do not complain. You figure out the new rules and you work within them, and you do not expect anyone from the outside to understand or help, because they never have before and there is no reason to think they will start now. The winter of 2022 into 2023 brought reduced activity. The creatures contracted their range toward higher ground where hemlock and spruce canopy provided cover. Merle's cameras recorded only 3 events between December and February. The silence in his hollow lifted somewhat. The coyotes came back, though they howled from the east side now, the side farthest from the ridge. The coyotes had adjusted their range too. They knew what was up there. Spring of 2023 brought the creatures back. Camera events started in late March. Tracks appeared in April, and someone else saw one. A woman about 2 miles north, along a different hollow, told a neighbor she had seen something standing at the edge of her garden at 5:30 in the morning. Tall, dark, 2 legs. The head was wrong. Looked like a large dog's head on a body shaped like a man's. There for 10 seconds, then it dropped and moved into the trees. The story circulated through the small network of families along the county road the way stories travel in rural communities. Merle heard about it within a week. He drove to her house and asked to talk. She was reluctant and embarrassed. He told her he was a retired DNR officer monitoring unusual predator activity. He asked her to describe what she saw. Her description was consistent with everything in his data: the height, the proportions, the canine head, the bipedal to quadrupedal transition. She was describing a dogman, and she had never heard the word. She thought she had seen something unique and impossible. Merle told her she was not crazy. He told her what she described matched reports from across the eastern United States. When he left, she thanked him and said knowing someone took her seriously was enough for now. The witness accounts confirmed what the data already showed. The creatures were ranging farther from the ridge, coming closer to houses, being seen by people who were not looking for them and who had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. The territory was expanding, or the creature's comfort level in the transitional zone was growing, or both. Either way, the buffer between deep wilderness and the settled valley was getting thinner every season, and the people living in the path of that thinning had no way of knowing it was happening. Merle counted at least 3 additional people along the county road who had mentioned unusual experiences to neighbors or family members without using the word dogman, because none of them knew the word. A man who heard something walking through the woods behind his barn at 3 in the morning that was too heavy to be deer and too bipedal in its footfall to be bear. A teenage boy who saw eyes shine from the tree line behind the school bus stop at 6:45 on a winter morning and told his mother, who told him it was probably a coyote and to stop worrying about it. A retired school teacher who found tracks in her garden that she photographed and showed to a friend, who told her they were from a large dog, which she accepted because the alternative was unacceptable. Each of these people had a piece of the same puzzle, and none of them knew the puzzle existed. Merle contacted the Marlinton White Sulphur Springs Ranger District in the fall of 2023. He called a supervisor he had worked with during his career, a man who respected his fieldwork. He asked whether the district had received unusual wildlife reports from the southern end of the forest. The supervisor said they had. A hiker on the Cranberry Wilderness boundary had reported a large, dark animal crossing a trail on 2 legs. A trail maintenance crew had found tree damage at an elevation and scale inconsistent with bear. A Forest Service employee doing road maintenance had heard vocalizations at night that made his dog refuse to leave the truck. The supervisor said these reports had been logged but not investigated. The Forest Service does not have a mechanism for investigating unidentified animals. Reports of cougar sightings are handled through specific protocol because cougars are a known species. Reports of large bipedal canines are not handled because the category does not exist. The reports sit in a file. Nobody follows up. Merle asked what would happen if he submitted evidence: camera footage, track castings, audio, a behavioral analysis based on 3 years of observation by a retired conservation officer with 30 years of field experience. The supervisor was quiet. Then he said the evidence would be received, reviewed, and filed. He said it would not result in investigation or management action. If the Forest Service acknowledged an undocumented large predator in the Monongahela, the consequences would extend beyond wildlife management. The Cranberry Wilderness draws hikers and backpackers from across the mid-Atlantic. Snowshoe Mountain Resort generates millions in tourism revenue. The Greenbrier River Trail is one of the most popular rail trails in the country. Acknowledging a large, intelligent predator would trigger safety reviews, environmental assessments, potential closures, and media attention that would damage the tourism economy, sustaining some of the poorest communities in Appalachia. The supervisor said Snowshoe Mountain alone brings in over 300,000 visitor days per year. The Greenbrier River Trail draws cyclists and hikers from Washington, D.C., and Richmond and Pittsburgh. The Cranberry Wilderness is marketed by the Forest Service as the largest wilderness area in the eastern United States. If a formal report documented a large, intelligent, undocumented predator anywhere near those assets, the chain of consequences would be immediate and severe. Public safety liability, insurance questions, congressional inquiries, media coverage that would make Pocahontas County famous for exactly the wrong reason. The supervisor said he was not telling Merle to stay quiet. He was telling Merle that the system did not have a way to hear him. That conversation clarified something. The institutional silence was not malicious. Nobody was suppressing evidence. The silence was structural, built into the architecture of every agency that should be responsible. The DNR has no species code for a bipedal canid. The Forest Service has no protocol for an unidentified predator. The county sheriff's office has no crime category for fence posts pulled from the ground by something that is not human. Each institution has a framework for known information, and when unknown information arrives, the institution routes it into the nearest known category. Bear depredation. General wildlife encounter. The truth gets filed under a label that makes it invisible, and the label is applied not by anyone trying to hide anything but by a system that cannot process what it has been given. The DNR officer who inspected Clyde's dead heifer was a competent professional doing his job within the system that trained him. The system told him the large predators in Pocahontas County are black bear, coyote, bobcat, and occasionally a transient cougar. The form on his clipboard had checkboxes for those animals. When he looked at fence posts pulled vertically from the ground by something with canid tracks and a bipedal gait pattern, the form did not have a checkbox for that, so he checked the box that was closest, and the report went into the database. And the database said bear, and the institutional record of what happened in Clyde's upper pasture in November of 2022 bears no resemblance to what actually happened. That is how evidence disappears in plain sight. Nobody hides it. The forms just do not have a place for it. Merle's wife found out about the trail cameras in January of 2023. She came into his office while he was reviewing footage and saw the screen before he could close it. She watched the clip, then another. Then she sat down and did not say anything for 5 minutes. She asked how long. He said 18 months. She asked why he had not told her. He said he did not know how. She asked if the things on the camera were real. He said they were. She asked if they should move. He said he was not ready, and moving might not help because the territory extended for miles. She adjusted, started locking doors at night, stopped walking the dog along the creek after dark, closed the curtains in bedrooms facing the tree line. But Merle noticed the distance. She spoke less in the evenings, stopped sitting on the back porch, started going to bed earlier. She was not angry. She was processing, living in a house at the edge of a forest that contained something she could not name. The breach of trust was quiet. His silence had denied her information she needed to make her own decisions about her safety. She was forgiving him, but slowly. What the knowledge did to Merle over the following months is the part of this story that no trail camera can capture and no track casting can preserve. He stopped sleeping through the night. He would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning and lie in bed listening to the hollow, his ears straining for any sound that did not belong, his body tense in a way that never fully released even when the morning light came and the forest sounds returned to normal. He stopped walking to his mailbox after dark, a trip of 150 yards that he had made without thinking for years. He stopped sitting on the back porch past sunset without the thermal monocular in his lap and his truck keys in his pocket. The back porch had been where he drank his coffee, read his mail, watched the light change on the ridge. Now it was a listening post. He told me that the worst part was not the fear. The worst part was the loss of the feeling he had carried his entire life. The bedrock sense that he understood the world he lived in well enough to predict its dangers. That feeling was gone. He had spent 30 years as the person other people called when something in the woods needed explaining. He was the authority, the man who knew the predators by name, by track, by behavior. And now he was the man sitting on his porch in the dark watching things through a thermal optic that his training said could not be there, and he could not call anyone about it, because there was no one to call and no category to put it in. Clyde lost 2 more animals over the following year, a calf in August of 2023 and another yearling in March of 2024. Both kills matched the pattern. Broken neck, clean throat wound, both in the upper pasture. The electric fence had been disabled both times, the wire cut cleanly, the cut points consistent with something gripping and pulling until it parted. Clyde filed both as bear depredation. A different DNR officer inspecting the second kill told Clyde he should consider reducing his herd size if bear pressure was that severe. Clyde thanked him and said nothing else. By late 2023, Merle had mapped a corridor running roughly north-south for about 12 miles along the western slope of the ridge system separating the Greenbrier Valley from the Cranberry and Williams River drainages. The corridor was about 3 miles wide at its broadest point. The creatures were using the transitional zone, the strip of forest between the high wilderness and the valley floor, as their primary range. They were close to houses, close to livestock, close to roads and the infrastructure of a rural community that had no idea what was living a few hundred yards from their back doors. The corridor made ecological sense once Merle thought about it the way he had been trained to think about predator territory. Dense forest for cover, creek bottoms full of game, from whitetail fawns in the spring to ground-nesting turkeys to the small mammals that inhabit every drainage in the Alleghenies. Proximity to agricultural operations, which meant livestock and the rodents and other animals that cattle operations attract, and the Cranberry Wilderness at their back, a 48,000-acre escape hatch of roadless terrain where no vehicle could follow, and where the Forest Service did not maintain trails well enough for casual hikers to penetrate more than a few miles. The creatures could hunt the edge and retreat to the deep interior if anything pressured them. The transitional zone gave them everything: food, cover, a buffer from the human world that they could manage on their own terms, approaching when they chose and withdrawing when they chose, maintaining a distance that worked for them regardless of what the humans on the other side of the tree line wanted or knew. In the fall of 2024, Merle captured the most significant piece of footage in his collection. A camera inside a hollowed-out stump at a trail crossing on the ridge recorded a single figure, large, moving at dusk. It paused at a claw-marked tree. The light was low but sufficient for the color sensor. The creature was dark-furred, heavily built, standing upright with the characteristic forward lean Merle had observed in every bipedal sighting. It reached toward the tree with its right hand, placed its claws against the bark, and drew them downward, refreshing the mark, maintaining the territorial sign the way a wolf refreshes a scent post. Then it lifted its head, and for a moment the camera captured the face in partial profile. The muzzle, the ear set, the eye, amber in the fading light, reflecting the last sun through a gap in the canopy. A face that does not belong in any field guide published by any state wildlife agency. A face Merle will never stop seeing when he closes his eyes. The footage remains with Merle. He has shown clips to 4 people: Clyde, his wife, the acoustics researcher, and me. The general area is known: Pocahontas County, the drainages between the Williams River and the Greenbrier County line. That is enough for context. The specific locations stay with Merle, because the specific locations are what stand between the creatures and the attention that would destroy them. That is the trap every credible witness in this field lives in: evidence that demands attention and implications that demand silence. If Merle goes public, 2 things happen. Nobody in an official position takes it seriously because the system has no place for it. Everybody outside the system takes it too seriously. The hunters, the thrill seekers, the armed amateurs who pour into Pocahontas County looking for something to photograph or shoot, pushing into the transitional zone, forcing a confrontation Merle has spent 3 years trying to prevent. The creatures have been patient and restrained. They have made themselves known without initiating violence against a person. The livestock kills are predation, the same way a wolf taking a calf is predation rather than an attack on the rancher. The fence breaches are access engineering, demonstrating an understanding of how barriers work that no wildlife management textbook accounts for. The camera removals are counter-surveillance, a recognition of human observation technology, and a deliberate decision to limit exposure. The porch encounter was communication, the step into the moonlight, the direct gaze, the 5 seconds of mutual regard before the withdrawal. Every interaction Merle has documented follows the same logic. We are here. We know you are here. We are choosing to coexist on terms you do not set and cannot control. And that coexistence depends on a balance that would be destroyed the moment the wrong person walks into these woods with a rifle and an attitude and no understanding of what they are confronting. Merle thinks about that possibility every day. What happens when a deer hunter on opening morning of rifle season sits in his stand at dawn and sees something through his scope that is not a deer, not a bear, not a person? What happens when someone who does not understand what they are looking at reacts with a bullet instead of stillness? What happens when the thing that has been restraining itself for years, that has been choosing warning over violence, encounters a human who makes the wrong choice at the wrong distance? The potential for catastrophe is growing every year that the creatures continue to descend from the high country. And the people who live in the path of that descent have no warning, no information, no framework for what is moving closer to their homes and their children and their livestock with every passing season. Merle asked me to think about what these mountains were before the logging companies came through in the late 1800s and stripped the old-growth timber down to bare soil, before the railroads pushed up the valleys and the coal companies hollowed out the ridges, before the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway reached the Greenbrier Valley in 1869 and opened the timber boom that would transform the Alleghenies from ancient forest to wasteland in less than 50 years. The West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company built a mill at Cass, in Pocahontas County, and the logging that followed was total. Every tree that could be reached by a railroad spur or a splash dam on a river was cut. The slopes were left bare. The topsoil washed into the rivers. The floods that followed destroyed farms and towns in the valleys below. The Monongahela National Forest was established in 1920 because the logging had been so destructive that the federal government had to intervene to save the watersheds. The Weeks Act of 1911 authorized the purchase of logged-out land for long-term watershed protection, and the first land purchases were in Tucker County in 1915. The forest that stands today, the nearly 1 million acres that covers the spine of the Alleghenies, is recovery. It is a landscape that was broken and is healing, and as it heals, as the canopy closes and the understory thickens, and the old logging roads disappear under decades of growth, the conditions that sustained something large and secretive in these mountains are returning. The forest is becoming what it was, and what lived in it before is becoming what it was too. Whatever is in these mountains survived the clear-cutting, the fires that followed, the floods that tore through valleys when denuded slopes could no longer hold rain, the erosion, the acid mine drainage. Through all of it, something persisted in the deepest drainages and highest ridges, in places too steep and remote for even the most aggressive timber operation to reach. It stayed. It waited. The forest grew back. The game returned. And whatever had been hiding came back out into the recovering landscape and reclaimed what it had lost. They came down the mountain because we built wind turbines on their ridgelines and broke their travel corridors and filled the high country with a sound they could not escape. They came down because we changed the landscape above them, the way we have changed every landscape they have ever lived in, and they adapted, the way they have apparently been adapting for as long as they have shared this continent with us. The Shawnee hunters who walked these ridgelines 300 years ago knew to avoid certain drainages. The knowledge was lost when the people were displaced, and now the creatures are at the edge of our communities, and nobody in any position of authority knows what to do about them. Merle still goes into the forest. He walks his transects, checks his cameras, updates his map, sits on his porch in the dark and listens to the hollow. Clyde checks his fences and keeps his cattle in the lower pasture and locks his dogs inside. The woman up the hollow draws her curtains before sunset. And in the forest above them, on the western slope of the ridge where the claw marks run from 5 feet to 7.5 on trunks of red oak and sugar maple, the things that came down the mountain are still there. Still moving, still watching the lights in the valley below with eyes that reflect amber in the dark, still making the calculation they have apparently been making since before the logging and the railroads and the wind turbines and all the rest of it, the calculation that says we can share this ground if the terms are right. And the terms are theirs to set, and the terms have always been simple. Stay on your side of the line, we will stay on ours. The line is getting closer to the valley every year. The claw marks on the trees are fresh. The tracks in the creek bottoms are deep. The cameras that Merle places along the ridgeline are found and removed with a regularity that tells him the creatures are patrolling their boundary the same way he once patrolled a wildlife management area, with method and schedule and a professional attention to what belongs and what does not. Merle told me one more thing before we ended our last call. He said that in October of 2024, on a cold morning just before deer season, he walked up to one of his old camera positions on the ridge. He had not been there in weeks. The tree where his camera had been mounted was marked. Fresh claw gouges in the bark, 4 parallel lines from 5 feet to just over 7. The tree had no food value, no territorial significance in the natural landscape. Its only significance was that Merle had once put a camera on it. The creature had come to a spot that mattered only because of Merle's presence in the forest and marked it. He stood there looking at those marks for a long time. He put his hand on the bark between the gouges and felt the rough edges under his fingers. The wood was cool in the October shade. The forest around him was quiet except for wind in the canopy and a raven calling from somewhere over the drainage to the west. He said he stood there and understood something he had been circling for 3 years. The creature knew his routine, knew his sights, knew which trees in the forest mattered to him because of the cameras and which trees mattered to it because of the territory, and it had chosen to mark one of his trees with its sign, a gesture that Merle could only interpret as acknowledgement. You are part of my landscape now. I know where you go and what you do here. It had marked the tree instead of destroying the camera that would have been there. It had left a territorial sign instead of a warning. Both of those choices told him something about how the creature viewed his presence in the forest after 3 years of shared occupation. He said if it wanted him gone, the message would be different. He said the marks on the tree were not a threat. They were closer to a greeting, the kind of greeting that 2 territorial animals exchange when they have spent enough time in each other's space to have established a working relationship that neither one fully understands, but both have decided to maintain. The evidence is in a house along a hollow in Pocahontas County. Trail camera footage, track castings, audio recordings, field journals. A topographic map with dozens of pins, all of it collected by a man who spent his career identifying predators for the state and found one the state will not recognize. And nobody who draws maps for a living has any idea what is standing at the edge of those maps, watching the valley, waiting for whatever comes next.